come in can. All right. I did give really passing mention to the Underground Railroad last time, but not a lot. So I want to mention it a little bit more this time. These are famous, very well-known black women who took people to the Underground Railroad. Now, because southern summers were really hot, maybe not as hot as this summer has been, but they could get hot, and there was no air conditioning. You really, the temperature did not cool down enough for you to get to sleep to about 1 o'clock in the morning. So once the sun had set, the black slaves could no longer work, so they would gather around the campfires and tell stories, and sometimes they'd practice their religion or whatever. Well, sometimes around these campfires, a woman would appear named Grandma Moses. She carried a pistol. And when she appeared at your campsite, everybody in the camp was going with her, whether they wanted to or not. Because she was afraid that if anybody got loose, they would run and tell old Massa, and the whole thing would fall through with. Neither of these women were ever caught. Grandma Moses, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, the South put a price on their heads, but they always escaped. And they would take the people to the Underground Railroad was neither underground nor was it a railroad. It was a place where you could go. The stations were often barns where that you could go and hide in the daytime and then get out at night. And not get out, but they would take you to the next Underground Railroad station. And you'd spend the day sleeping, get up at night, and go into undercover of darkness to the next Underground Railroad station. And you would keep going till you got all the way to Canada, because if you went anywhere in the United States, laws were passed that your masters could come and find you. I mean, if you were a slave, it is. All right. Sojourner, by the way, was the name of a Martian robot that went to Mars and explored Mars. And again, 3 persons who helped operate the Underground Railroad. All right. The Mormon migration. The Mormon movement was founded by Joseph Smith, and I really probably should have written that name down. Joseph Smith founded the Mormon movement. He and his brother were eventually killed. So, Smith. The Mormon movement started out in upstate New York, near New England, next to New Hampshire. It went to Ohio, to Missouri, then backtracked to Illinois, and everywhere they went they were persecuted until they got all the way to Utah, and there in Utah they were finally left alone. They found some really fertile land in Utah, and their descendants are still living there to this day. And Utah is still primarily a Mormon state. They were accused of polygamy, and in some cases it's known that yes, they actually were guilty. We have records where that some of the men had more than one wife, and we have the names of the men and the names of their wives. So eventually, though, they abandoned their practice of polygamy because it brought down the wrath of the rest of the country upon them. Now, I know this school is in the middle of a Mormon community with a lot of Mormons living around here, and some of you might be Mormon. But I want to say this, though, I mean this in the Mormons' favor. Of all the communes, and the Mormons were a commune, they were just about the only one that actually worked and actually lasted. I mean, they lived in communes, just like the others, but they actually survived and have survived to this day. And again, I personally think that, I mean, this is just my opinion, I can't prove it, but I think that the reason they survived was they kept their women happy. These things, you depend on the women in order to survive And like that cult I told you about, the Children of God, their women were very, very unhappy, so the whole commune split up. In the case of the Mormons, it was different, and they don't live in communes anymore, but they're still around, and are no longer confined to Utah either. All right, in 1821, during the turmoil in Spain, during the turmoil that Spain was involved in turmoil in Europe. Mexico broke away from Spain and became independent. Immediately they set up a constitution and outlawed slavery, because the other Latin American countries were doing that, except for Cuba, except for some of the smaller countries. The only big country in Latin America that did not outlaw slavery was Brazil. They did not outlaw slavery until 1880, 15 years after it was outlawed in the United States. But Mexico outlawed slavery right away, and believe it or not, this actually did not endure them to the Americans, who were determined to bring their slaves in. The Santa Fe Trail ran from Independence, Missouri, down here to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and it was a trade route. Now, this part of the territory, the book is calling Northern Mexico, because the time it was Mexico. That involves Texas, California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, what is today the southwestern part of the United States, was at this time under the control of Mexico. Americans moved in because the Mexicans largely wouldn't. The area was very thinly populated. The northern Mexican territories were often at war with each other and at war with the Indians. Again, folks, this was a problem that Mexico has had, and they can't even keep peace among themselves. At times they do, and at times they don't. The Americans in Texas poured in rapidly, and they soon outnumbered the Mexicans living there. The Mexicans realized they were outnumbered, so they were outnumbered, in Texas. So they tried to stop the Americans from making slavery illegal. The Americans called their slaves servants, and then they kept bringing their black servants into Texas, when everybody knew, including the Mexican government, that they were actually slaves. Well, now, folk, here was a problem too. The Mexicans changed governments every 2 years, so it was very unstable, maybe 2 or 3 years. And one government would invite the Americans in so that they'd have people living in these territories. The next government would try to keep them out. Well, finally, due to several issues, including slavery, and this is one issue I have to take the side with the Mexicans, but with the other issues, I won't go into detail, but I can't side with Mexico on them, but Santa Anna took over, and he did not believe in democracy at all. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, didn't believe in democracy at all, did not give anyone a voice in government. Texas rebelled. Santa Anna marched with 3,400 men. He bumped into 180 men at the Alamo, but the walls, the Alamo was a mission, but had stone walls that were very strong, strong enough even to repel cannon fire. But the Texans were outnumbered 3,400 to 180. Every American died who fought at the Alamo. Among them were famous men like Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, Colonel Travis. I don't have his name up there. But now, here was where they did some good. They killed, 181 Texans killed 1,800 Mexicans, because the Mexicans would march into battle tall and proud against the Texans who were behind the stone walls. So the Mexicans lost a lot of men, so that meant Santa Anna had about 1,600 men left. Santa Anna then went to Goliad and killed 365 Americans at Goliad. Now, don't anybody write this down. This is me, my father, my grandfather, last name Cunningham. Then the names change. Mary Kissane. That's an Irish name. Her father was Percifer. Now, his father was Richard. Richard had a twin brother named Percifer. This twin brother was one of the Americans, 365 Americans killed at Goliad, 1836. This one was born in 1836. This one, by the way, was a college teacher. But anyway, this one was born Percifer Kissane. This is my great-great-great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, great-grandmother. You know, he was born in 1836, and Richard Kissane named his next son after his twin brother who had died at Goliad. Now, I had an 8th grade history teacher who soundly condemned the United States for going to war against Mexico. Folks, the war might have been justified. I mean, Santa Anna slaughtered a bunch of Americans for no reason. He accused them of being pirates. There was no trial. They were simply lined up in front of a firing squad and slaughtered. This made the Americans angry, but the United States did not go to war for another 9 years. Well, at this point, the Texans rallied. They rallied around a man named Sam Houston. All right, Sam Houston caught Santa Anna napping. Now, folks, if you know anything about the Mexicans, they have a habit of taking a siesta in the afternoon. A lot of doctors say this is a good habit. And some companies, if I understand, give their employees the option of taking a siesta in the afternoon, because once your siesta is over with, you're wide awake. I have gotten sleepy behind a wheel many a time on a long trip. I can pull over to the rest stop, sleep about 10 minutes, rest about 20 more, and then I'm awake for the rest of the day. Some of you might know what I'm talking about. So taking a siesta is a good idea, except you don't take a siesta when you don't know where the enemy is. The enemy, namely Sam Houston, was just on the other side of San Jacinto Hill. And once the Mexican army was all sound asleep, Sam Houston's 750 or so men swooped down on them and they cried out, "Remember the Alamo! Remember Goliad!" Santa Anna fled, and of course any of you have been in the military knows when your commanding officer flees, the whole army flees. Santa Anna got spooked. Well, Sam Houston's men went around rounding up the Mexicans, and one of the Mexicans they rounded up was Santa Anna himself. I was asked once, why didn't Sam Houston and his men kill all the Mexicans? My answer is that Sam Houston and his followers were just not evil enough to do that. But they did make Santa Anna sign a paper giving Texas its independence. And Santa Anna had to leave all of his weapons behind. Then he and the men who were left were they were sent to the border, where once Santa Anna crossed the border, Mexico overthrew him and Santa Anna had to live in exile for 9 years. Now he came back. He came back in 1845 and took over again. Anyway, Mexico feared it was going to lose California even as it lost Texas. Now folks, one point I want to make. The United States did not take Texas from Mexico. Texas took itself. Texas set up an independent state. They asked to be admitted to the Union. Their request was denied because they would come into the slave state. So they had to wait. They began to ally themselves with Great Britain, and this terrified the United States because they said, hey, what if that big territory becomes a British colony? And a lot of people were concerned, but nevertheless, Texas is not going to come into the Union right away. President Jackson tried to buy California. Mexico would not sell it. John Fremont claimed he had taken California revolt. Keep that in mind because we'll talk about it in a few minutes. But now, the politics of expansion put the United States in danger with Great Britain. This territory right here, it was called the Oregon Territory, and it consists of a vast amount of territory. The United States claimed we own it all the way up to here, 5440. And the slogan became 5440 or fight. 5440 was the parallel lines, these lines that go around the world. We didn't really have a good claim to the territory, but some Americans are moving in, and some Canadians are moving into this territory here. Eventually, the United States and Great Britain sat down at a table and worked out an agreement to where the line that was already there would be drawn all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So the United States got what is today Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. And Canada got what is today Manitoba, Saskatchewan, British Columbia. They got that territory. So we worked out a deal where we split the territory, you might say, in half, with Canada and the United States getting a fairly equal share. Now, I've already mentioned how that William Henry Harrison pretended he was in good health on Inauguration Day. The inaugurations in those days occurred in March. It was raining, and he stood out in the rain for an hour and a half, proving I'm tough, I'm a soldier. He caught pneumonia. He would not rest. Instead, he was a Whig, and he felt like my duty is, and what people expect of me, is to get rid of all the Democrats that I can and appoint Whigs in their place. Of course, he only could do that with the executive branch. He could not fire anyone who worked for the legislative branch, the judiciary, but he felt like he had to get rid of all the Democrats in the executive branch. So he began working long hours to make appointments. In 1 month in office, he was deceased. Shortest presidency on record. Well, Tyler was the first vice president to take office when the president died. They tried to tell him, hey, you're just a vice president. He said, I'm going to take on all the duties of a president. I have the full powers of president. Then he proved he really was not a Whig. He vetoed some Whig legislation. The Whigs wrote him out of the party. He's like the only president in history who turned against the party that elected him. He had never really belonged to the Whig party anyway. So the Whig big victory of 1840 quickly turned to ashes. All of Tyler's cabinet resigned except for Webster. He stayed around to negotiate the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. That's the name of the treaty that separated the United States, that set the border between the United States and Canada. All right. The Whigs rallied behind Henry Clay and said in 1844, we're going to win that one too. They didn't. The United States didn't, well, they were afraid that Texas would come into the slave state, which it would have, but they also were afraid that admitting Texas would bring war with Mexico. And so Texas had to wait. And I've already mentioned Texas allied itself with Great Britain. The Texans often traded shots with Mexico along its border. Tyler worked hard to get Texas in the Union. He wanted to see the country get bigger. If he had stayed loyal to the Whigs, he might have pulled it off, but his power was broken. He was a president without a party, purely and simply. Folks, you don't turn against the party that elects you. You need the party. Every president has. Tyler did not realize that. Of course, Tyler had no precedent to guide him. No other president had died in office before his time. In 1844, Henry Clay ran for president. He tried to avoid the question of annexation of Texas, knowing it could cost him votes. He finally came out against it. That didn't help him. The Whig Party nominated Clay anyway. Now, here's something that's unique. In those days, candidates were chosen by convention, and even that was fairly new. But they've got together in a convention, the delegates, and chose her candidate. Well, of course, the candidate had to get a majority of the votes at the convention. No candidate could. Martin Van Buren, of course, he already had a bad record because the country had had a rough time under him. He opposed annexing Texas, so he was not nominated. The party did something that had not been done before. They chose a relative unknown called a dark horse. Now, Polk had been governor of Tennessee, but other than that, he was not known well outside the state of Tennessee. But when they could not agree on the more prominent men, they finally chose a dark horse because he could at least get the votes. This is what often happens when conventions choose. And I mean, I've heard it often has probably happened with the Catholic Church when they choose a pope. The cardinals cannot agree on the more prominent men, and finally they'll choose someone who's not so well known but who doesn't have a whole lot of enemies. So as a case of Polk, he didn't have a whole lot of enemies. He could get the votes, so they finally chose him after spending days going back and forth with candidates who could not get a majority. Well, Henry Clay losing, by this time Henry Clay was getting old, and losing his, like the third election in his lifetime was a really, really difficult pill for him to swallow. Again, he waffled on the Texas question, already mentioned, but he didn't gain anything by doing so, and Henry Clay almost won, but Polk won by a narrow margin. All right, by this time Tyler was a lame duck, so he decided to act immediately on the annexation of Texas. Now keep in mind, the election occurred in November. In those days, presidents took office in March. Today, presidents take office in January, but in those days, so that meant that Tyler had from November till March to act. He managed to pull it off. He got Texas into the Union. Texas was admitted as the 15th slave state. Anyway, Polk was facing a war with Mexico, which he was somewhat trying to provoke. He could not risk a war with Great Britain, so they divided up Great Britain, and the United States divided up the Oregon Territory, and I think both sides were happy with it. Canada got what's today British Columbia, Manitoba, Saskatchewan. The United States got Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Washington, and Oregon. So this kept Great Britain off her back, and also taking Texas in the Union meant that Great Britain would not get it. All right, the Mexican War. I had an 8th grade teacher who slammed and condemned the United States soundly for going to war with its weaker neighbor. The history books I had in high school also slammed the Mexican War. But again, you have to remember, Mexico had slaughtered a bunch of Americans, and this provoked a lot of hard feelings, so it was not all the United States' fault. The United States, and in 1845, the United States admitted Texas as a state. Polk also wanted New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and California. In other words, Polk wanted these states right here. Texas we already had. Polk wanted this territory here. This we already had after an agreement with Great Britain. Well, there was a dispute on what the border was between Texas and Mexico. Texas claimed the border was the Rio Grande River, but there was another river. The Rio Grande River flows right here. There was another river, the Nueces River, that flowed several miles north of the Rio Grande. Mexico said that Nueces River was the border. Polk said the Rio Grande River was a border. Texas said the same thing. So Polk sent some troops into the territory just north of the Rio Grande. Mexico shot at him, and this gave Polk the excuses that he needed to ask for war. Polk said he said Mexico has shed American blood on American soil. Therefore, we should go to war. We're justified going to war. Congress declared war, but not everybody agreed. Some people said it was like we're bullying a weak neighbor by a being greedy and expansionist. Now, a new congressman, this was the only time Lincoln ever served in the federal government before he was elected president. Abraham Lincoln, he was in the House of Representatives for 2 years, 1847 to 1849. He denounced the war. President Polk ignored Lincoln. Lincoln was not that important. But this became important later because when Lincoln became president, Benito Juarez was president of Mexico at the time, and Lincoln and Juarez were friends, and some of the rift between the United States and Mexico was slightly healed because of the fact that the American president and the Mexican president were personal friends. The Whigs made an attack on Polk and called it Mr. Polk's War, but most Americans favored the war. Now, folks, here's where Polk made one of his bigger mistakes. A leader should learn to delegate authority. In other words, he tells one of the men who works for him, you look into this issue and then report back to me, and you look into this issue and report back to me. A true leader delegates authority. Polk directed the war from the White House. He goes down in history as the first president who probably died as a result of the strains of office. He insisted on getting his hand even in the most trivial matters that should have been delegated to some lesser authority. But he'd work 18 hours a day and probably only sleep 4 or 5 hours a night. Polk wanted a short war. General Zachary Taylor, who became president after Polk, won a couple of quick victories, and he became popular with his troops right away. So President Polk made him commander for the conquest of Mexico, even though later we'll find they fell out because Polk did not think Taylor moved fast enough. Kearny took Santa Fe without firing a shot. Kearny then headed for California to take California. On the way, he met Kit Carson, who said, hey, California's already taken. Here is where Fremont had all kinds of problems anyway, with incompetence. Fremont had been to West Point. Kearny had been to West Point. Both men knew that when two officers got together, the one with the highest rank was to take charge and the other was to be subordinate. Kearny outranked Fremont. Therefore, also, Kearny had a paper showing that he had orders from the President of the United States to take California. Fremont should have taken a back seat and given California to Kearny. He didn't. Instead, he insisted on governing California. That is Fremont. He was not capable of doing so. And California rebelled against Fremont's rule, but Kearny had to fight to take Los Angeles. When he got Los Angeles, California was then in American hands for good. In the meantime, Taylor went on to take Monterey. Then Taylor went to meet Santa Anna, who had taken back over after a 9-year exile. He met Santa Anna at the Battle of Buena Vista. Now, here's where that Taylor had a stroke of good luck. They fought for a day, and Taylor knew he was losing, and he was in a process of retreating. But then Santa Anna got some news that he was needed somewhere else, so Santa Anna got up the next morning and left the battlefield, even though he actually probably knew he was winning. He left the battlefield because he had to take care of something else somewhere else. Taylor claimed victory. I mean, if you know anything about the military, when the other side leaves the battlefield, you can claim victory. So Taylor claimed the victory. perhaps justifiably so, and he became known as the hero of Buena Vista. Americans felt invincible. However, things like scorpions and rattlesnakes and disease took more soldiers than the enemy. Yes, I was in Mexico once. Yes, I got really, really badly sick. Many Americans who go to Mexico get sick in Mexico. The Mexicans are immune to some germs that are there. Americans who go to Mexico are not. I wasn't. But I was able to recover. A lot of Americans, though, in the 1800s who fought in the Mexican War, some of them did not come home because they died of illness, and some of them who did come home were permanently disabled for the rest of their lives, not from enemy bullets, not from enemy bayonets, but from the diseases they caught that they never fully recovered from. And again, in those days, you could get a disease and it might take years to recover. You still can. I mean, I know a woman who got some kind of lead poisoning, and it took her many, many years to recover. Anyway, Polk decided that Taylor was not decisive enough. Again, Polk was a Southerner, a Tennessean. This was one of the reasons the South lost the war. If a general doesn't move as fast as I want him to, I'll get rid of him. So anyway, Polk appointed Winfield Scott to go to the Mexican capital and told Taylor to stay in the north, which Taylor did. Scott went to Veracruz on the Mexican coast. Veracruz surrendered. Santa Anna tried to trap Scott. The Mexicans were routed. Scott then could not go to Mexico City because his men did not enlist for the duration. Now today, when there's a big war on, you enlist for the duration. I mean, I'll put it this way. They did that during the Civil War, during the Spanish-American War, and during World War I and World War II. You enlisted for the duration. But in those days, they enlisted for limited times. Most of the enlistments were running up, so Scott had to wait for new troops. Santa Anna, in the meantime, fortified himself in Mexico City. The fighting there was brutal, but the Mexicans retreated. At that point, Mexico had no fight left. Mexico gave the United States, Texas, New Mexico, California. We already had Texas, really. But New Mexico, Arizona, and California, and Nevada. Mexico received $15 million. Then the United States left Mexico with a whole lot of hard feelings. Now, a few years later, about 10 years or so later, the United States bought some more territory from Mexico for a sum of $25 million. This area right down here called the Gadsden Purchase to build a railroad. And a lot of persons felt like this exorbitant sum of $25 million was conscience money to try to ease our conscience for taking all this other territory from Mexico. And by the way, the railroad, this territory that we bought for $25 million was practically worthless, except for the fact it would hold a railroad. But we wanted it. Mexico agreed to give it. Mexico needed the money. And the railroad eventually was built. All right. In 1848, we got California, and shortly afterward, we discovered gold in California. The gold there enriched the United States instead of Mexico. All right.